Welcome, everybody, to the Healing Place podcast. I am your host, Teri Wellbrock, and excited to have with me today Gretchen Schmelzer, PhD. Did I say it right?
Yes, you did.
All right. Yay. So welcome.
I'm glad to be here. I've been enjoying your work.
Thank you so very much. Yeah. So I just was saying before we started recording, one that when I stalked your website, I connected on so many levels to one of your blog posts that I really want to talk about the GPS one, because your work is in the trauma realm. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
My blog covers mostly trauma. I wanted it up there to help people understand trauma better, and also try to create a different conversation around trauma that kind of respects how hard it hits, how long it takes to heal, depathologizes it, and allows more people into the conversation, having enough information so it doesn't just stay with the experts.
Right.
So that was my goal. But in looking at healing, I also really look at things like parenting and understanding growth and memory and learning. All those pieces come into play in healing. So I sort of branch out in different places.
Yes. One of the things that I read was in your work with clients is how many of them quit because it's either too scary or too long of a process. And so your book, I think you address about that exact thing of sticking with it and really the journey of healing.
Right. I mean, part of my motivation for writing the book was just that people come to therapy to feel better. Right. Yeah. And that's what everybody in their world tells them. Oh, go see a therapist. You'll feel so much better. Right. And that is true and not true all at the same time. Right. I think there's a sense of relief in knowing that you're getting help. But in healing from trauma, you often feel much worse before you feel better at different points in time. And if you don't know that, you think you're doing it wrong, or you think, you know what? Who has time for this? Or, I wanted to feel better, so I'm out of here. And so I wanted to help people know where they were. When I used to go backpacking in the White Mountains, you'd look at the map and where the lines were really close together, you knew you were supposed to be miserable because it was really steep, right? You had some validation that for this amount of time on this trail, it was going to be ugly. And then you get to a nicer place. And I feel like for healing, for therapy, for a lot of the sort of all in the mental health world, there's not enough maps for the people going through it. I think therapists get a lot of information, actually. I have lots of books that say, that's going to be really hard for that person. But I don't feel like on the other side, there was enough explanation to help have people have patience and compassion for themselves.
I love that. And I tell people that in the podcast, I always end with be gentle with yourself. And that was a huge, I think the two things I learned, I did EMDR therapy, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing for anyone listening. And I did it for 4 years, 98 sessions, and we kept circling back to the trauma. But two of the things that she taught me, my therapist taught me, was be gentle with myself and to just notice. And so when sensations would arise, when panic or anxiety and body memories would come back around, just noticing without judging what was happening were too huge. But yeah, the being gentle with myself, that was a whole new concept for me.
Yeah.
It really kind of took me back, what?
It's sort of that one of those simple but not easy instructions, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, for sure. So the 5 steps in the book, the title of the book is Journey Through Trauma, a guide to the 5-phase cycle of healing repeated trauma. And do you want to talk about the 5 steps at all?
Sure. So I'll start out actually with the whole idea of repeated trauma. So much of trauma, when it's described either in the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or kind of out in the world, the symptoms describe much more the experience of acute trauma that might happen once from a car accident or a violent event, right? But repeated trauma has a different effect on people, and it requires a different healing process. So repeated trauma really has three forms of trauma. It's what did happen, so whatever events did happen over the course of time, and then the protections or defenses that we create to survive it, that essentially over time can become part of the fabric of who we are. They
Right.
become your personality, or they become just the way you are with people or out in the world. And then it is also, the third thing is what didn't happen. So the growth and development you weren't getting or doing while you were experiencing trauma. And part of the reason I think that healing from repeated trauma is so hard is that we, as a culture, we think of the first form, what did happen. We get people to tell their stories or kind of name what happened, but we don't give enough time to the next two, which is how do I untangle the defenses? How do I untangle the protections so that I'm not using the old rules anymore? And how do I start experimenting and being brave enough to do the things that I didn't get to do, right? So those three things require a kind of a different way of approaching the healing journey, I think. And because it requires sort of multiple passes, and it's not sort of a straight shot.
Yes.
Or the 3 easy steps too. I used to joke.
Right.
Well, I used to joke that I wanted to write the book that was like 4,000 really difficult steps to change.
Oh my gosh. I just was envisioning my head. Mine was kind of like this, back, no, this way. We did this a little bit, then we came back, then we went that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just really hard. So what I looked at, I grew up in the psychology world of really good thinkers. So, I studied Judy Herman's work coming through my education that had 3 phases, which was really safety, remembrance, and mourning, and reconnection. What I did was just, start looking partly at the language and also kind of at the black box nature of remembrance and mourning, and trying to come up with language and some categories of action that might help people know a little more specifically what gets done. So in terms of safety, I decided to call that first part of the work preparation, partly because as a trauma survivor, even if it's called safety, you don't feel safe yet. And so you're always in conflict with the language around it, and feeling like, oh, you need to please somebody, saying like, oh yes, we're working on safety, but you have no earthly notion what that means. So I think from a therapist point of view, it totally makes sense. Like we're helping this person work on feeling more safe, right? But from the client side, I'm not sure that made much sense. And I think it encompasses the work that needs to get done. So if you and the therapist, or you and your group, or whoever the intervener and the containing force is, can look at what needs to get done during that time. So, what are the resources that person has, external resources, internal resources, the relationship between the therapist or helper, and how can you, what needs to happen so that feels strong and connected, and how do you prepare for emergencies or crises so that you have some sense of what's coming. And so once you do that, and that for some people that's 2 weeks, for some people that's 2 years. It's not a determined period of time. So once that happens, in some ways, the next phases come when somebody does feel safe enough to start letting some of the defenses down. So you move from preparation into what I call unintegration, which is things start coming apart, but it's an intentional coming apart. And this is the part where most people would quit. Like, I'm done. I'm having these big emotions, what we might call emotional flashbacks, or I'm feeling like that I'm not on solid ground anymore. I used to have a way of always dealing with this, but now I'm trying to give that up. So now how do I feel? I'm shaky. And it's different than disintegration, which is that you fall apart, right? That you actually go back to the worst things you ever did to take care of yourself. That's not the same as unintegration. In my book, I use the example of the temples at Abu Simbel, where they were going build Lake Nasser, and they had to move the temples up. And they didn't knock them down. They took them apart stone by stone and rebuilt them on the shoreline of the new lake.
Yeah, so crazy. And I hate to interrupt, but just for a second, because as you talked, I had visions of like someone in a fortress and just slowly taking the walls of defense down. Like it's a purposeful act of taking it apart. And you do feel very vulnerable because all of a sudden you don't have all this that you've put in place.
Right.
And so I get it. That's exactly what I envisioned. Yeah.
Right. And as things come apart, so the thing is that as things come apart, you're having emotions or parts of the story, or the way traumatic memory works is that it's not written down as a paragraph. It's almost like random words and feelings spread out. And as they come up, that you move to the next stage, which is identification, which is naming those pieces, putting some language to that experience, right? Whatever the pieces are. And as you're able to do that, you suddenly start getting little pieces of a whole, which moves to integration, right? And that's why it's a loop, which is that you're not going to probably get your entire life story in one loop, but you'll get pieces. I had a client who put together 1,000-piece puzzle. And, when we were sorting the puzzle, you dump the puzzle on the table, that's on integration. When you're picking up the pieces and trying to figure out what they are, that's identification, right? So like it was a puzzle of emperor penguins. So you pick up a white piece and you're like, penguin, ice, sky? You really couldn't have been any of those. And then you'd make a decision. And the truth is, another 2 weeks goes by and you realize that wasn't sky, that was penguin, right? So I think that what's important as you're going through this cycle, they're all hypotheses. They're all, you're guessing. It's an experiment all the way along, and not some necessary truth with each statement, right?
Right. Yeah. And what popped into my head there was, with EMDR, I would have I would think of them as crazy random thoughts pop into my head, but I knew that they were memories. I knew that they were connected to something, and most likely to a trauma that we were tapping into. And so I would just talk out loud about, I don't know, I'm flying over, a bridge on a tricycle. I mean, just crazy, like weird little things like that. But I had, at the time, such a horrific fear of bridges. And so it was my brain trying to find some sense of this thing that was haunting me. Yeah.
Well, and partly, the way, our emotional memories stored in our amygdala mostly. And so that the way memory gets stored, it's just not in, novel form. It's written down, and it sometimes takes some passes to get at what you're trying to say or what it means, right?
Yeah.
So once you start putting together the pieces, that's where the past can become the past. That's where you can see a more integrated whole of what you experienced at any given level of this. And when the past becomes the past, two things happen. One is that experience of mourning that Judy Herman talks about, that when you can see it, you can also say, wow, I lived through that, right? That it feels different. And simultaneously to that, I think you also get these moments of new beginning, that where you suddenly realize, if that was then, this is now, and so what now, right? And there's a little bit of space that opens up where, most people who've experienced trauma for a long time stop living in anything but an ever-present past. They're just trying to protect themselves from the trauma they've already lived. And when you can finally see it in the past, you suddenly get like the present and the future in a way that you would not have gotten.
Yeah, beautiful.
And then the last phase is consolidation. So there's a way after that sort of information hits and can sit somewhere, there's a period of time, and there should be a period of time, where you actually just live with it, where you aren't trying to get to the next thing, Sometimes it's a planned break. I've had clients where we said, you know what, for these next 3 weeks, we're not going near the trauma. They were, getting married, or they were doing something in their present life that we wanted to block from the trauma, actually, right? So sometimes it's a planned break, and sometimes it's just a rest period. And then at the end of that, you move back to preparation by saying, all right, what worked in this cycle? What didn't work? What do we need to pay different attention to? And you get to come back to it through that conversation.
Yes. Yeah. And I love the circling back around, because it's almost like you're picking up more pieces, like, oh, I didn't see that before. Okay. Right. Right.
And we would have more connection, more capacity to manage a difficult conversation. And with each pass, you get that and can learn more about how to manage the trauma in relationship. Most repeated traumas are repeated relational traumas, right there. And so part of what you're trying to mend has to be mended in relationships. So this preparation phase and how it gets done is as important as what is getting done.
Yes, absolutely. Amen and hallelujah. So tap into now about the GPS, because I'm dying to get to it, because again, when I read it, it was such an hallelujah moment for me.
Yeah.
About trauma.
So I'll just sort of repeat that part of the story, which is that I was in my brother's truck. He lives in Nashville, and I was looking at the screen, and it occurred to me as we were talking that his GPS screen was broken and wasn't actually showing where we were. It was a map. Sometimes it was Missouri, sometimes it was Idaho. But wherever we were driving, it was showing that we were somewhere, but we weren't where we thought we were. And when I looked at it, I thought, oh my God, this is just like living with trauma, that you have an internal GPS that's saying, this is where I am, but you're in an external world, which is not where you are. And I wanted to shout at the console, like, stop, this is it. This is exactly what it looks like. My GPS thinks we're in the middle of a lake. And you think I'm on a highway,
Yeah, I read it, and I wanted to scream at your blog, like, yes, that's it. Because how many times I'd be here in this, life right here and now, but I'd be flashing back to 1988 or, right. Yeah.
Right. And it, the visual was so helpful because it's a physical experience often, right?
Right.
And I used to try to describe it that, you're sitting at a dinner table with everybody who seems to be having a lot of fun, and you feel like it's raining on you, like you're soaking wet, and everybody else is dry and clean. But because of where you're sitting, that's what the experience is. But the GPS really does feel to me like it's perfect, because you are trying to navigate your world with this data that you have that doesn't fit your present situation.
Yeah.
You're constantly trying to make it fit. And, that's one of those symptoms of trauma that you're not going to find in the DSM, right. that it really that even if your flashbacks go away and like all the big symptoms go away, these are the things that interfere with daily life. They interfere with your doing the job the way you want to do your job. They interfere with you being in your marriage the way you want to be in your marriage. Like, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of really being able to live a healthy adult life, right?
Yes, right.
And being able to slow down enough to sort of say, all right, this is my GPS. This is what it's telling me. It's not real, right? That's the what did happen.
Yes.
And I'm doing all my protections are trying to keep that GPS in place, right? Everything I'm doing is trying to keep the old rules in place, because I think I will go off the road. I will drive off the cliff if I don't stay on my map, right?
Yeah.
But and that's where the risky part, that's the unintegration part, which is, all right, I'm going to take that map apart. I'm going to walk, in some ways, I'm going to walk blind. I do not know where I'm walking because I don't have experience walking in this world, in the map I'm living in, right? And that's what, that's the hard part. And I think we have to help, that's the conversation I want to change. We need to help people tolerate that risk. We have to be like, yeah, you're doing it.
Yeah.
You go.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I want to throw some hope on it, in that it's difficult, at least for my personal journey, as difficult as it was to walk into each of those 98 sessions and to know I was going in to face, that history, right? Yeah. And that you said tangled something earlier and tried to untangle it. And I had a vision of that. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Christmas Vacation, but he has this gigantic tangled ball of Christmas lights. And that's how I always envisioned it. Was like, okay, I'm going to try to get one little strand at a time here. But I knew I was going in, but I always walked out, even though I, may have had tear stains on my face, feeling just a little bit more on track, a little bit more enlightened, a little lighter load. And so, my encouragement to people is yes, keep doing it.
Yeah. You get to be you get to be all you, right? Yeah. You get to use your gifts in the world. You get to live in the life you're creating. Yeah. So I'm all for it too.
Very cool. Awesome. So any other things that you wanted to tap on and talk about?
So my book focuses primarily on in some ways more on the individual level of healing, like any person could pick it up. And I'm also doing a lot of work trying to help communities heal issues where trauma is the root cause, and understand the impact of trauma at the community level. So maybe 20 years ago, 16 years ago, I got pulled into a phenomenal project by a friend who had started a consulting company, and they got a request to help 4 different countries strengthen their response to HIV and AIDS. And one of the 4 countries was Cambodia. And at the time, I was working as a therapist with kids and families around Boston. And really, my life goal was to be like the chief psychologist on a child psych unit at that point. And then my friend Fran called and said, come help us think about, how do you teach emotional intelligence to people who've lived through trauma? Because Cambodia had just come through the Khmer Rouge. And so I went down and chatted with them about that, and we looked at their design. And then a month later, they called and said, come work for us. Come do leadership development. Because it was a leadership and development intervention in a public health situation. So, with a fork in the road, I jumped ship from my old dream and went and started doing leadership development, and made 11 trips to Cambodia in 4 years, and, started looking at, so it was really helpful for me to see, trauma at the large system level. So I had sort of kind of worked it at every level of system, from individual to family to groups, and now really a country. And that's part of really what helped me write my book, was to start to see the patterns at every level of system. So the cycle isn't different. It's just what the behavior, what you might do might be different, right?
Right.
And so I was actually just out in Eugene, Oregon last week, working with their homelessness operations team, the people who on a daily basis are trying to serve their community and also serve the homeless population in their daily work, even if that isn't their job title, right? So if I'm head of the parks department, or I'm a fireman, or all of those jobs interface with a very traumatized population. And some of those jobs, like police and fire and EMT, have trauma built into their jobs anyway.
Right.
So, it's been very interesting to try to help people understand, the impacts of repeated trauma and how those might show up and impact their own leadership, right? So, if I'm under stress and narrow my focus because I'm under stress from trauma, I'm not going to do the same job as a leader as I would do if I were less stressed and I had managed that, right? And that has all sorts of implications for these very large scale community issues.
Yeah, powerful. Yeah. And again, just so, I'm just blown away how the more we find out about trauma and the impact that it is having, not just on individuals, but just how it filters out, right?
Under stress, people are less likely to take in information from the outside. People are less likely to seek out people who are different than they are. So if you think about community, the implications for community, it's massive. And then there are a lot of issues. So I've worked with communities around the opioid issues. I've worked with communities in Alaska around domestic violence and sexual assault and child maltreatment. So, you look at most of these issues and underneath them is trauma.
Yeah.
And, in the Cambodia days, we had to slowly get there because it was a war and we were working through translation and things like that. I think where I am now is I feel like we don't have time anymore to let the community get to the fact that it's the root cause. I'm like, all right, I'm 54. I got 30 years left to do something. Let's just start with the fact that if you know more about trauma, you could probably be helpful. We still do the leadership work. We still do other things to help them engage their community. It's not all trauma. But if we don't name it, I feel like we're wasting time.
Yeah, right. And I think the light has been, it's just shining more and more and more on it, that more people are starting to understand, oh, yeah, that probably has to do with trauma.
Well, it's really interesting. So when I started, it took me about 10 years to write my book. And then I finished it, and there was about 2 years of trying to find an agent. And actually, so I started my blog because I was trying to find an agent and I wasn't having any luck. And a friend of mine said, start a blog. And I thought, well, nobody reads those, in my mind. I just thought it was there's just all this information. But I thought, well, on the safe side, nobody reads them. So it's a perfectly safe activity. So I created a blog and started writing. And about 6 months into the blog, I wrote a piece and I'm like, oh, it's kind of sappy. Maybe I'll put it up. Maybe I won't. And then I remembered nobody reads it. So it'll be perfectly safe. So I put it up and it went wildly viral, 2 million hits.
Oh my Lordy.
Don't even believe it's true that, only cats on roller skates get that kind of
right.
And it's called the letter your teen can't write you. Letter your teenager can't write.
Yeah, I saw that on the parent page, but I hadn't read it yet. It was the second one down. Yeah.
It totally went viral. And an editor saw it and went to my page and saw I had a manuscript, and she said, send it to me. So I did. And she's like, oh, our publishing house doesn't do the kind of work you're doing. But I took the liberty of sending it to an agent. And that, a couple of different conversations with agents that week. And then literally that week I got an agent. And it took a while to write the book. And then the book comes out into, the Kavanaugh hearings and the Me Too movement. And this wasn't the context I wrote it in, right? I wrote it in a context where it was still the whole idea of trauma was lodged in the mental health world. And Columbine had happened, but not Aurora and Parkland. And in the intervening years, trauma has become part of most people's experience, actually.
Right.
So it's not, I think it's not a specialty anymore. It's part of what needs to be in the mainstream conversation so that we understand both how to heal it and then perhaps how to create more, that preparation phase we need to now start doing in our communities.
Yeah.
The way that I don't think we thought of before, that, only in special circumstances or those were, people's private problems, but they're not private anymore.
Mm-mm. No. And I'm glad they're not, because
Yeah.
they need to be talked about. Well, one, makes people not feel so isolated. I know when I first started putting my story out, I did it on Facebook to my friends and
Yeah.
family, and just bleh. I finally started putting it out there, and holy cow, I was so amazed by how many people reached out to me privately through private messenger or text or phone calls or whatever. Oh my gosh, me too. I mean,
Right.
like truly, I experienced this, or I experienced that, or and just they'd never told anybody before. And I think now that the conversations are happening,
Right.
it's just helping people find their healing paths.
And, I think what's really important is you have to move past just the saying your story out loud.
Yes.
Testimony isn't enough.
Right.
And I feel like there is, maybe it's from the old kind of like talk show movement or whatever, that there's a very high value on tell your story, right? But there is the value isn't on, and now work with it.
Yes, right.
Right now,
right.
And now work with the things you did to survive, and now work with the things you didn't do and have to learn awkwardly as an adult, right?
Yeah.
I feel like in some ways we get people to come out and then we just leave them on a docks.
Yeah, right. And that's why I say, I always talk about being on the healing path, because the healing path is it's your journey, and you have to figure out a way to then navigate it by filling your toolbox with whatever it is that you need to heal, that trauma. Yeah. Very cool. So any myths or facts that you would like to clarify for listeners?
I mean, I think the biggest myth is that, there's a quick fix.
Right.
No. And, and I think that another myth is that you're all alone. I feel like the tale of the mustard seed really applies, like, as you were saying, all the Me Too's. I think I forget the name. I feel badly. I forget the name of the woman who tweeted, like, tweet me a story of your sexual harassment, and 27 million people replied. Right, so that you're super not alone out there.
Right.
And I think the other myth is that you can do it alone. We live in a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, self-help, right?
Right.
And there are things that you can use self-help for. I'm not knocking self-help, but healing from trauma, I think, isn't one of them. If you were hurt in relationship, actually you have to mend in relationship, and it requires it. I think the idea that you could just go off and do it by yourself is a myth. And I think that people try almost anything they can before they sort of have to lean on somebody. And I want to encourage them to do it sooner rather than later.
Yes. Yes.
You can get a lot of those years back if you don't do that.
I wish I had, it all happened the way it was meant to happen, but had I known sooner, instead of, because I battled with severe panic attacks for 25 years. And I think, God, 25 years of just trying to, again, go back to what you wrote about, trying to navigate through my life and my world with a map that I was like, I don't know where I am. I don't know what I'm looking at.
Why do I keep running into things?
Right.
Right?
Oh, brilliant. I just love it. Love it. All right. How's our time? All right, we're doing good. I have to ask you my favorite question, only because it's my favorite question.
Okay.
So if you could meet anyone in the world, dead or alive, to help you with your journey, whether it's your professional, personal, or both, who would it be?
It would have been Nelson Mandela. I feel like he walked through fire. And the work I'm especially trying to do in communities, I wish I had, his solidity around that, and his ability to hold people, all kinds of people, with compassion and thoughtfulness. I'm like, I feel like I'm 100 years away from that level of patience, but I aspire to it. If I could learn it, if I could get it through osmosis.
Yes. Right. Oh yeah. What a gift. What a gift he gave so many.
Yeah. I mean,
right.
like if I were going to do a whole dinner party, I'd add in like Maya Angelou.
Right.
It's a counterpart in some way.
Oh, that's a good question. I should add that one. If you could have a dinner party, who would you invite?
Right. I mean, in some ways, in the work I do with leaders, I talk to them about creating like a personal board of directors, like an imaginary board.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And those are people in my imaginary board of directors, right? Who feel they're not my ancestors, but I feel like I aspire to their thoughtfulness or their integrity.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, beautiful people. I had a podcast guest once say, create your dream team in your head. Who would be in charge of marketing and who would be in charge of, this? And that was fun. I mean, yeah. Great to build that team of who you would surround yourself with. Yeah.
Right.
Cool.
Right.
All right. Anything else you want to touch on?
My biggest sort of thing I try to carry out into the world that is similar to what you're saying. Healing is possible. Like you don't have to be stuck there. And not only is healing possible, but you can live in a way that you can't imagine if you actually, do the hard work of it.
Yeah.
And when you heal, you give other people courage to do the same. So it's exponential. When other people see you take risks, they're more willing to take risks. So it's really worth it. It's worth it not just for the individuals, but it's worth it for whole families and communities.
Yes, agreed. And again, I just want to reiterate to people that you can. I always thought, I'm finishing up a manuscript myself, and I always thought I had to be fixed, cured, not broken anymore to finish my story. But the beauty of it is that being able to live this life filled with tranquility and joy, which I do, while still on my healing journey. Because do I still have panic attacks on the highway? Yeah, actually I do. But I'm aware of it, and I'm working on it, and I look at life as an adventure as I learn more about how to get through these moments that may come back around, that I may circle back onto with my trauma. But I can still be joyous and I can still be tranquil. And I think everyone can get to that place. I truly believe it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Cool. All right. Well, I thank you for joining me on the podcast. And again, you've enlightened me in so many ways, and just brilliant. The GPS thing, I'm still going crazy over it. So yeah.
Thanks so much for having me and letting me share my stories.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, until next time, remember to be gentle with yourself. Thanks for joining us on the Healing Place podcast. Bye-bye.